I'm about to have an interview with my father, Jerry Robecky, who is one time, about 20 years ago, saw what is believed to be a UFO. But here's his account of it. Okay, Dan.
Well, uh, your mother and I were coming back from a trip out in Arizona. Well, at that time I was on temporary duty with the Air Force in a place called Yuma, Arizona. And I just completed some gunnery training in Yuma, and we were driving back, and the year was, I believe it was 1955. It was either in the late February or early March of 1955. And we were someplace in western New Mexico, and we heard over the radio on one of the national news networks that apparently, folks, the statement went something like that this must be the flying saucer season because people have been reporting them around the country. And I wasn't a believer at the time, or a non-believer for that matter. I was just kind of agnostic about the whole thing. And I didn't pay really that much attention to it, to the significance of what this man said at the time. So we came to a lonely little stretch of the highway in New Mexico, and there was a motel that we spent the night in. And I remember this real well because we got up in the morning to bathe, and the temperature was so cold out that all the plumbing in the motel froze, and we couldn't perform our daily ablutions. So we took off and got back in a car and went down the road and kept on driving and eventually we got to Kansas City. We were headed for Duluth, Minnesota at the time. And it was late at night, and we stopped at Kansas City and had dinner. And my intentions were to grub up and start traveling north again, and at least get on the north side of Kansas City and spend a night there, so we wouldn't have to fight any of the Kansas City traffic early in the morning, and then we'd have a clear shot at Duluth, Minnesota, our destination. Well, we were about on the north side of Kansas City. Matter of fact, we were clear of town, and at this time we were looking for a place to spend the evening. And I remember the time real well because it was 5 minutes to midnight, and the sky was absolutely clear. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and there were a million stars twinkling upstairs. So about this time we were traveling north, and I could see in the right-hand corner of the windshield that there were 3 or 4 lights that got my attention, and these lights seemed to be moving towards us. And I kept watching it. We must have watched it for about 4 minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Then I asked your mother if she sees what I've been seeing, and she said, "Yeah, I've been watching those things too." So these lights kept getting closer to the car, and I couldn't make out any sound on these objects, and I was trying to make out the roar of a jet engine or so, or other airplane noises like from a reciprocating engine. So as they got closer and I couldn't hear any sound, I pulled off the side of the road. Still couldn't hear any sound, so I turned off the engines, or the engine in the car. I listened, couldn't hear any sound. At that time I got out of the car and your mother remained inside. And I leaned up against the front bumper and watched these objects as they came closer. And about the time they got to the highway, they turned about 45 degrees and sped across the highway, and they continued until they went out of sight. They went over the western horizon.
Could you please describe how they looked to you?
Well, they were typical, I guess, saucer shaped, elongated, like if you look at a cigar or something, like they were elliptical shaped, and they were.
These are the lights you're talking about now.
Yes, I couldn't see any shape of the aircraft or spaceships or whatever they were. This whole thing was illuminated, and the illumination was the shape of a cigar or a saucer that was edgewise. And there were three of them in formation. They were in pretty close, tight formation, I'd say. You could detect movement between the three of them, but there was a fourth man, like in a typical fourth-ship fighter formation. One of these guys was kind of like flying top cover. He'd pull out of formation and he'd meander off to the right a little ways, and then he'd climb up a little bit higher, and then he'd drop back, and then he'd race ahead, and then he'd scoot over to the left, just like he was a scout of sorts. And that's the way he performed during that period that we saw him, and that's the way they were behaving as he went over the horizon. Now, I don't know what these things were. I thought they were airplanes at first, but I looked at them. I said, if these are airplanes, they've got to be an awfully strange-shaped airplanes with all this light paraphernalia on them. And here again, I was being a pilot at the time, and a jet fighter pilot, familiar with all the latest aircraft in our inventory. I was trying to assimilate it with the size of an aircraft, and I was flying an F-86, F-86s at the time, F-86 Sabre jets, and not knowing the size of these objects, I would say, though, that if these things were the size of an F-86 Sabre jet at the time, they were probably about at an altitude of 1,000 to 1,500 feet in the air, and they were doing about 300 knots. And however, there was no sound associated with these things, so they more than likely were quite a bit higher. Okay, as they went across the horizon, a police officer or highway patrolman pulled up alongside of us and got out of the car and asked us if we were having any trouble. We said no, and I called his attention to the lights that we were watching, and he kind of, he didn't even bother to look at them. He just said, well, okay, if you're not having any trouble, folks, that's all I want to know. And he hopped back in his car and raced away. So as far as I know, at that time, we were the only witnesses to these things. So we got back in the car and started our car up and proceeded north looking for a motel. And your mother asked me if I was going to report him, and I said, yeah, I would as soon as I could get to a telephone. So when we got to the motel, I checked in a motel, and I called the Combat Control Center over at Richards Gabor Air Force Base, which is just south of Kansas City. And I identified who I was, and I talked to the officer in charge, and he allowed, as there weren't any aircraft in the air at the time, and not in this area, and the only aircraft that they had coming through the area was a SAC B-47, a bunch of B-47s that were on a refueling mission, and they were still quite a ways south. about that time, he said, "Just a minute, please," and he said, "Yeah, they're reporting these objects over. I forgot what the place was now, either uh, Joplin or St. Joseph, Missouri, or somewhere in that vicinity. Already had some reports of them being down there." And then about that time, he said one of the controllers noticed that, or he had uh, paints on the scope or blips on the scope that were moving across the scope at a rate of about 50 miles for every one sweep of that of the radar set. And their sweep usually takes about, if I remember right, about 30 seconds. So these objects that he was painting on the scope were moving across at a very rapid rate. So that was about all I had to say to the OIC over of the Combat Control Center at the time, and we checked in a motel, went to sleep, and your mother didn't get too much sleep that night. These things kept bothering her all night long, and all the next day. And then we went to Duluth, and as soon as I got into my home squadron up there, I checked in with the intelligence officer up there and gave him a full and detailed report of the happenings. And nothing's ever been said to me about those things since. So.
And another thing, how fast do you think they might have been going, judging from, altitude and all that, since you could not really tell how high they were, or how far away? Give an estimate.
Well, here again, yeah, like I say, you have to know the size of an object, and there was no depth to these things. There's a couple of the dimensions were missing, so I really can't guess. But as this thing was doing, this controller, in effect, had these things on his radar scope. They had to be doing somewhere at least 4,000 miles an hour or something like that. If he was racing across the scope at 25 to 50 miles a clip for every sweep, they were in that vicinity at least. But here again, they'd have to be pretty doggone high because there was no sound to them. So,
Could you give that other account of that one Air Force friend of yours, please? And
okay, that was about a year later. I'm not exactly sure what the date or the time was, but it had to be a year later because that placed me in Sioux City, Iowa, about 1956. And we were stationed at Sioux City, Iowa, and on alert one night, and a friend of mine by the name of George Alfrey, who was, he got out of the service. He didn't retire, but he left the service in about 1957, and he's been a captain for American. He's been flying for American Airlines ever since that time, and he was on the alert with me one night, and he got scrambled, and it was it must have been around 10 or 11 at night, and he was scrambled down into the vicinity of Omaha, Nebraska, and the ground controllers told him to look here and look there, and search high and search low, and he couldn't find anything. So at that time they said, George Alfrey said, "Look, I'm getting low on fuel. I've got bingo fuel, and I'd like to return to the base." So they said, "Okay, you're released." He was on his way back to the base, and about that time they said, "Hey, we got one more report. This thing is reported over near Florence Station. Would you mind going by there and on the way home and checking that out?" He says, "Well, okay, as long as it's on the way home, I'll check it out." So he headed over in that direction, and they said, "Well, people have been reporting this this object, the saucer-shaped object that was hovering up there and dropping what looked like burning parachutes, fiery parachutes. So he said, he went over in that area. He said, well, I can't see anything. And then they told him to search high. And so he started searching high with his radar set. And about that time, he looked up visually and he saw what, in effect, was what I just said earlier. This saucer-shaped object dropping fiery parachutes. I asked him if he put it in afterburner to get up there and get a little closer look at it. And he said, yeah, I put it in afterburner. He says, I put it in afterburner and went right to Sioux City. So when he got down, he was quite a heavy smoker anyway, and he must have gone through a package of cigarettes in about 10 minutes after he was on the ground. He had one cigarette in his left hand, one in his right hand. I think he had one in his mouth, smoking up a storm. So did a lot of stammering and stuttering about what he saw. Kind of made an impression on him, I gather. But that was about the size of it.
So he's been for airline pilot 20 years, huh?
Well, he's been a pilot, at least 20 years.
Got right out of the Air Force, huh?
You want any more of that?
Thanks a lot, Dad. You have anything more to say?
Keep them flying.
Hey, we'll get
Keep those UFOs flying.
Yeah, we got one of ourselves. We'll catch Mom here tomorrow, okay?
Speak about close encounters. Wow.
January 27th. I have my mom, Miss Robecky, here, and she's going to give an account of what she saw about 20 years ago with my father over Kansas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, no, I think it was Missouri. It was Grandview, Missouri. We were outside of Grandview, Missouri. But it was more than 20 years ago. It was in 1955. It's more than 20 years.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, we were coming back from Yuma, Arizona, and it was dark, about, I guess, around 7 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock maybe, and we were going toward Kansas City, Missouri. We were going to stay there overnight, and there were a lot of stars in the sky. And it was winter time, or it was March, but there was snow on the ground, and it was cold. And we'd been driving along for a long time, and just both your daddy and I were looking out at the sky. And finally he said to me, or I said to him, I don't remember which, have you been watching those lights? And or whoever said it, I don't remember, said, yes, I've been watching those. And there were a series of lights that were going across the sky. This was a 4-lane highway. And these lights kept going back and forth or around on the sky in front of us. And it was like a formation of 3 lights. And then there was a 4th one that would stay in formation, and then all of a sudden it would break out and it would go up above and to the side and underneath, like it was flying around, scouting. So we pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car, and the lights would come across the highway. They did it a couple of times, and your father said that if it were an airplane and those were landing lights, by the size of the lights, that it would be about 500 feet in the air. And he said that if that were so, if those were landing lights on an airplane, that you would be able to hear something, and you couldn't hear anything. It was noiseless. and they made a couple of passes back and forth across the highway. And then when they'd go back up and farther away, the fourth light would start going up and down and around and zigging around. Do you want me to tell about the highway patrolman?
Yeah, say everything.
Well, when we were stopped on the side of the highway, this police car pulled up behind us and wanted to know if we were having trouble. And your dad said, well, we were looking at those lights and we're concerned or wondering what they were all about. And the highway patrolman said, oh, well, that's from the air base. Grandview Air Base was close. And he said it was just those airplanes flying around. And he didn't think it was anything special. So we got back in the car and went into town, and I don't remember what town it was, outside of Kansas City. And your dad called the operations room at Grandview, and he told me that it sounded like the operations room was just in a state. There were phone calls and people were running around talking and hollering and carrying on. And they had spotted these lights, and I guess it scrambled some airplanes. And they were in a real dither about it because they didn't know what it was. And he asked your dad all about, where we'd seen them and what we had seen. And then he said, wait a minute, they're clocking them over Wyoming or Montana or something. And it was in a very short period of time, just a couple of minutes or seconds, that they had lost them on radar. They had gone so fast that they had lost them on radar. And they didn't know what they were.
What color were those lights?
They're just lights like on an airplane, landing lights.
Just mere yellow tint or reddish or?
No, just like they look like lights on an airplane.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mom.
Welcome, David.
My mom has a little footnote here she'd like to tell us.
Now do I tell my footnote? Okay. Remember when your father was talking about George Alfrey and his experience with the UFO? Well, right after that, and he probably won't even remember this, right after that happened, we were sort of, or I was sort of nervous about flying saucers. And I was pregnant with your brother, Jerry, so I didn't sleep well at night, and it was hot. And I would be awake a lot at night. And one night I woke your daddy up because I could hear all these airplanes flying. I could hear all these engines flying. And finally I woke him up and I said, what are all those airplanes flying out there? And he didn't want to wake up and he was disgusted. Do you remember? You don't remember that? And finally I nagged him so that he got up and called the base. I said, call the base and find out what that's all about. And I guess he got curious because he thought maybe there was something going on that he didn't know about, or maybe they'd called him and he didn't hear the phone or something. So he got up and he called the alert hanger and got one of his friends that was on alert and said, what are all those airplanes flying around? My wife woke me up and told me to call the base because she heard all these airplanes. And I don't remember who it was that was on alert or who answered the phone. But he says, what bar are you calling from, Rollback?
John McLeod. This is Airman John McLeod at Perrin Air Force Base, Texas. I'm talking with Major Jerome Rolbecki, a pilot at this Aerospace Defense Command base, who recently completed 3,000 hours of flying time in the F-102 Delta Dagger jet interceptor. He's believed to be the only man in the U.S. Air Force to log the equivalent of 125 days flying time in the F-102. Major, how long have you been flying the Deuce?
Approximately 13 years. I checked out in the interceptor in 1957 at Truex Field, Madison, Wisconsin.
Why is it so difficult or unusual to rack up 3,000 hours flying time in this aircraft?
Well, 2,000 hours is considered an unusual amount of flying time in any single-place fighter. 3,000 hours is kind of a landmark. The average flight time in a fighter, and the F-102 is no exception, is approximately 1.5 hours. When you consider the preparation that goes into each flight, briefings and debriefings, this represents a considerable amount of effort.
How many separate flights do 3,000 hours represent?
At an average of 1.5 hours a flight, this would be about 2,000 flights.
What purpose does the F-102 serve in the U.S. Air Force and the Aerospace Defense Command?
The aircraft is considered to be old in the air defense business and has been replaced by more up-to-date interceptors like the F-106. However, it still performs its role adequately in many parts of the world and is currently in operation in many of our Air National Guard units. The Air Defense Command uses it primarily for training purposes now.
What have been some of your prior assignments flying the F-102?
Oh, at one time or another, I've been stationed or deployed in the fighter in most parts of the world. During the Cuban crisis, I was deployed with it to Florida, where the interceptor played a very important role. My most recent assignment in the F-102 was with the NATO forces in Europe. I was assigned to the 32nd FIS at Schusterberg, Netherlands.
Well, what was your mission with the 32nd Fighter Interceptor Squadron in the Netherlands?
We combined our forces with that of our allies to supply air defense cover for Western Europe.
What is your job here at Perrin?
I'm a flight commander with the 4782nd Combat Cruise Training Squadron, and to be more specific, I'm an instructor and help to train pilots in advanced intercept techniques.
Thank you, sir. We've been talking with Major Jerome Rolbecki, a pilot of F-102 Delta Dagger jet interceptor aircraft here at Perrin Air Force Base, Texas. Major Rolbecki is believed to be the only pilot in the U.S. Air Force to fly over 3,000 hours in the F-102, a figure which represents 125 solid days in the cockpit of the Aerospace Defense Command's mainstay aircraft. This is Airman